University. I'm a political scientist as well as a law professor, and what I'm going to do is more of a deep dive into American politics today, and in terms of understanding the 2024 election. Specifically, what I also want to point out to you is a couple of things. One, I have a lot of slides in here. I'm not going to cover them all. I've already told Zach and other people here, the PowerPoint is yours. You can use it, you can draw upon it. There's going to be some slides here that I'm going to pass over very quickly, but you might say, gosh, that's really interesting. I wish you would talk more about it. Feel free to contact me in the future, and feel free to use me, as many other journalists do, as a resource in terms of understanding things about American politics. So again, it's U.S. elections and the implications for Europe. So the main thing I want us to think about here, and I'm going to try to do today very quickly here, is describe how American politics has changed over the last 50 years. So I want to give you a context, a sense of what's happened to America. 2, talk a little bit about the recent elections. 3, talk about the current and future landscape of American politics. Look at the forces that are going to affect the 2024 election, and explore how the U.S. 2024 elections could impact European security needs. The other thing I'm going to do today, I'm going to give you, at least on the basis of what we know today, what the prediction is going to be for the 2024 elections in the United States. All right, so a whole bunch of things I want you to understand here. First off, I know for many of you, every political system is odd, every political system is unique. The United States is, of course, very odd here, because we actually have a system called the Electoral College. It's not the direct national popular vote that determines who's elected President of the United States. It's the Electoral College. It's basically in the United States, I'm going to point out, it's 50 separate state elections where the candidate for president has to get 270 electoral votes. So one of the things I'm going to tell you right now is that for any of the national polls that you see in the United States, ignore every national poll. The national polls do not mean a thing, because we can elect a president of the United States who does not win the popular vote. Remember, that happened with Hillary Clinton or Secretary Clinton back in 2016. To understand everything about American politics, it's going to be eventually, I'm going to talk about how our race in the United States to pick the next president is going to come down to a few swing voters, actually in a few swing counties, in a few swing states. I'm going to convince you that this year, the entire U.S. presidential election comes down to about 150,000 voters. That's all it's going to really be. The simplest way for us to think about it, this may be one of the most important slides. If you can't pay attention to anything else, this is the slide that gives you everything. I'm going to argue that the key to understanding the presidential election this year is either 555-270 or 666-270. And what I mean by that, it's going to come down to either 5% of the voters in 5 counties located in 5 states of the United States that get us to 270 electoral votes, or it could be roughly 5 or 6% of the voters in 6 counties in 6 states that are getting us to 270. I will give us... translator needs to be a little bit slower. I'm from New York. I'm sorry, folks. I talk too quickly. All right, sorry. Okay. So it's going to either come down to a handful of voters in a few counties, in a few states, and we're going to talk about which those are. In terms of thinking about the issues, this is, yes, a Trump versus Biden repeat, but it's not the same election as it was 4 years ago. There's significant differences. Things that I want you to be thinking about here, it's about how at some point things such as abortion or reproductive politics are going to play big. It's going to be increasingly looking again at what female voters do. In fact, as I point out to people, the most important voters in America are college-educated suburban female voters. They determine what happens in American politics. Among issues, Biden's age and approval rating are big factors. Trump's legal problems. As some of you know, right now, we're in the closing days of the New York trial, and that's pretty significant for reasons I'm going to talk about here. Issues that are going to be important, Israel and China. I'm actually going to change this a little bit here and say that far, far, far down on the list is Ukraine. I think you were making the same point before also. The southern border in terms of immigration. And just to point out something kind of interesting here, just in case you're saying, my God, this is just a basic repeat. the electorate looks different this year than 4 years ago. That between people, I'll be not so nice, dying off, and people turning 18 and eligible to vote, 18% of the electorate will be brand new this time. That's a pretty big shift at this point. Okay. All you need to know again is 555-270. I'll explain more about that in a few minutes here. I'll skip over this slide here about how I got interested to do this kind of work, all about it. I'm going to skip over some of these other slides here, but I do want to point out something significant with this slide here, is that for the last 30 years in American politics, what we call the baby boom generation, that generation born right after World War II and born until early 1960s. This is the generation of Bill Clinton, of George Bush. This was the generation and the voters who dominated, absolutely dominated American politics for the last 30 years. They are exiting out of the political system. What we are now starting to see, and we saw this 4 years ago, is that the baby boomers are exiting from the system. And that's important for a whole bunch of reasons, because generations carry with them memories. Generations carry with them particular types of values. And as we're shifting away from the baby boomers, shifting to what we call the millennials, shifting to what we call Gen Z, we are seeing dramatic shifts in terms of party alignment, in terms of the issues that are being discussed, in terms of basically the agenda being set in American politics. Much in the same way that we're seeing across Europe and across the rest of the world, there's a significant generational shift going on. We're seeing this in the United States. Other thing I'm just going to briefly mention, we could talk about more in the questions and answers. One of the criticisms that has been brought up in the last 2 elections, major election cycles in the United States, is where people say the polls have gotten it all wrong. They never predicted any of what was going to happen. The reality is the polls have been dead on score. They said back in 2016 that Secretary Clinton would win the national popular vote, and they were right. The polls said that Clinton was probably going to lose in the Electoral College in the critical swing states, and they were exactly right. 4 years ago, they said that Joe Biden would win a big victory at the presidential level. He largely did. I can't speak to polling outside the United States, but I can just tell you that polls, while they're not predictors, are good snapshots in time, and they do give us fairly accurate information in terms of what's happening here. Okay. How did America's politics change over the last 50 years? The story, I think, of the United States, as well as the story of a lot of the world now, and we talked about it this morning, is the story of polarization. And the way I like to describe the United States is, think about if we went back to approximately 1980. If we were to look at American public opinion approximately 45 years ago, we were to do polls, the good polls, such as Harris, such as Gallup, National Opinion Research Center, the Pew Center for People in the Press, or Pew Center, and you were to ask people a variety of questions, and you were to plot American public opinion out from the most liberal to the most conservative, what you would roughly get is a bell-shaped curve. You would get some people on the far left, some people on the far right, but notice the vast majority of public opinion would have been in the center. There was broad political consensus on a whole bunch of issues. And with that, we would have seen significant overlap in terms of the 2 political parties, the 2 dominant political parties in the United States, Republican and Democrat. By the way, my curves may not be exactly on score. I'm doing the best I can with my graphics, but this is pretty close in terms of what it looks like. And if we were to look at American politics 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that nearly bell-shaped curve, the 2 political parties, Democrat and Republican, generally converge to the center. If we were to describe American politics and to draw that bell-shaped curve and cut a line right down the middle, political scientists would call that the median voter. Half the voters to the left, half the voters to the right. The center of the Democratic and Republican parties were pretty close to the dead center. Additionally, we knew back then that both the Democratic and Republican parties were what we call coalitional parties. you would have found conservatives, liberals, and moderates in both of the parties. They were ideologically mixed. In our lower house of our Congress, our House of Representatives, there are 435 members. 1980, 1/3 came from swing districts. These were districts in any election. They could go Democrat or go Republican. This 1/3 was important because neither the Democrats nor the Republicans alone could drive the political agenda themselves. They needed these swing voters, these swing districts, I should say. They drove consensus. And back then, approximately 10 to 15% of the voters we would describe as swing voters. That is, they might vote for a Democrat for president, a Republican for governor, or one election they might vote for a Democrat, the next election they might vote for a Republican. What did this mean in terms of American politics? The candidates, rather I should rephrase it, the parties generally nominated more centrist candidates. They converged to the center. The center of the two political parties were near one another. Because the parties were ideologically diverse, we found a high percentage of votes in Congress were bipartisan. That is, both parties agreeing on things. And if we think in terms of the issue of getting legislation adopted, there was very little gridlock, very little polarization. Describe American politics as what? Consensus-driven back then. But now, let's push it to the present. Over a roughly 45-year period, we now see American politics looking not like a bell curve, but it looks more like what? It looks more like this sort of double humpback, or it looks like a bipolar curve. That what has happened over time is that the percentage of the American public that defines themselves as ideologically in the center, or partisanly in the center, has gone down. The centers of the two major parties have pushed further and further apart. People are increasingly identifying themselves as more extreme. You probably can't see this graphic very well here. The Economist magazine did a very good picture a few years ago and shows the deterioration of that bell-shaped curve over time and the separation occurring. Why is all this important? Because if we think about American politics now, these graphs, these pictures, these description I'm giving to you captures perfectly what is happening in American politics right now. We've transformed our American politics from being what? A bell-shaped curve to a bimodal curve. And the implications are significant. The two political parties have sorted themselves out now. If we look in Congress right now and look at voting records, the most liberal or most progressive voting Republican still has a voting record more conservative than the most conservative Democrat, and vice versa. We see that 120 swing seats have been reduced down to only 30. There's barely any seats that are really in play. And that 10 to 15% swing voter, because of the polarization, best estimates are now there are between 0% and barely 5% of the voters are swing. We know in this current election, 90% plus of Democrats are going to vote for Biden. 90% plus of Republicans are going to vote for Trump. There is very little movement at this point. And what it also means now to be a swing voter is not to say, gosh, I'm going to vote Democrat for president, Republican for, let's say, governor. To be a swing voter now means to swing in and show up to vote, or swing out and decide not to show up to vote. It's an incredibly small percentage. What we also know, as I said, the centers of the two parties have moved further apart. Most votes in Congress are partisan, straight party line votes, and because of the gridlock, we're experiencing the least productive Congress in American history, or at least, let's say, at this point, at least in recent American history. To show you how polarized we are, this may not mean anything to you, but in the United States would be. It's not just that the parties have separated out in terms of partisanship. We also know that Democrats and Republicans don't like to live in the same locations. They have different lifestyle preferences. We also know in the United States that Democrats and Republicans have different consumer product preferences. Democrats shop at different stores compared to Republicans. They eat at different restaurants. In the United States, this would be meaningful. If you told me you lived near a Whole Foods grocery store, I could nearly perfectly predict that you were a Democrat. If you shop and eat at Chick-fil-A, I could nearly predict that you're a Republican. Or I could go in all the different directions. For example, I say to my American audience, you tell me you drive an electric or a hybrid car, I know exactly how you're going to vote. Geography, politics, and marketing have converged. Okay. The disappearance and changing swing voters, as I mentioned to you, American politics has shifted because of the polarization, that we have very few swing seats, very few swing voters. But what it means to be a swing voter, I told you swing in or swing out. For our purposes, keep this in mind, the three critical swing voters to look at. College-educated suburban women. Like I said, what they do determines everything. They show up to vote, Democrats do well. They stay home, Republicans do well. People under the age of 30, they show up, Democrats do well, they stay home, Republicans do well, and people of color, the exact same thing. Remember, as I said to you before, ignore all national polls. It's about the Electoral College. It is about the fact that we do not elect a president of the United States by straight popular vote. It's the race to get to 270 electoral votes. If you want me to explain the Electoral College, we need about a week. It's an incredibly confusing process, even for the American audience it is. But keep that in mind. Okay. I won't go into all the details here in terms of some earlier arguments that I made here in terms of how I was analyzing the elections here, in terms of putting it together. I'll simply point out again, even across the different states of the United States, there's a political division. And what I'm going to point out to you now is think about the last two presidential election cycles. In 2016, to show you how close and how polarized American politics was. In 2016, it really came down to what? Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Had Secretary Clinton picked up approximately 90,000 votes properly distributed across those three states, she would have been president of the United States. 4 years ago, it came down to Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Had 43,000 votes properly distributed been moved over to Donald Trump, he would be finishing up his second term right now. This speaks to how close, how tight the election is. Again, I'm going to skip over some of this other stuff here, a few things here, slides here. If we also think about going into this election, if we were thinking about classic political science analysis, political scientists would argue that good predictors of presidential elections is to look at the presidential approval rating in the second quarter of an election year, along with the electorate's views about the economy. Right now, Donald Trump's approval rating is about 39%, approximately where Donald Trump's was at this time. The American public is not very happy with the economy. I think you pointed this out a little bit too. It's the inflation factor. People are going to the grocery store, seeing the cost of milk, cost of eggs, whatever it is, still going up. They're looking at how much they're paying for gas. The American public is not very happy about the state of the economy right now, and polls overwhelmingly indicate that the American public thinks American society is going in the wrong direction. So as we start to think about, more focused now on the 2024 election, it's going to come down to, I'm going to argue, a few swing voters in a few swing states. This is another slide. If you really just are sort of focusing on a few small things, and from a journalist perspective, you want to understand where all the action is. This is where it is. It's going to look at, I think, approximately 6 states. Look at what's going to happen in Arizona, more particularly Maricopa County. Look at Georgia, Fulton County. Look at Michigan, Wayne County, Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, Nevada, Clark County, Wisconsin, and Brown County or Door County. That's what the election is going to come down to. It's going to come down to about 150,000 voters in terms of what they do. Some other things to think about here. I learned a new term earlier this year. It's called dual haters. Approximately 20% of the population of the voters equally hate Donald Trump and equally hate Joe Biden. And the question is, what are they going to do? Are they going to stay home on election day? Or are they going to vote for the lesser evil? Or are they going to vote for Robert Kennedy Jr.?
You're talking about the counties, these days.
Yes.
Not the country.
Yes, of course, yes. And let's see, did we lose our PowerPoint here?
Yes.
Hold on a second. Bring it back. Okay, we go back. Okay, so yes, we should talk a little bit about this. This is going to be a race. Okay, underscore my point here. It is 150,000 voters in about 5 or 6 counties that are going to decide this presidential election. And this is going to be an election where, unlike some other countries, where generally our third parties don't matter, third parties are going to matter this time, moving very small numbers of people. In terms of the election, again, Biden versus Trump repeat. Again, polls do not favor this lineup. It's the oldest contest ever in American history. But when I say the polls don't favor this, about 60% of the American public says, oh my gosh, I don't want Trump versus Biden again. In terms of looking at Trump, Trump has a solid base. His supporters are behind him no matter what. He's got right now some evidence that the independent voters, those few voters that are undecided, are leaning toward him. However, he's got the criminal and civil trials. And there's evidence, polling, again, that suggests that if he gets a criminal conviction, 50% of the undecided voters would say, I'm less likely to vote for him. For Biden, he's got incumbency. He gets to run against Trump and the Republican Congress. However, he's got an age factor, he's got low approvals, and because of his age, the focus is increasingly on his vice president, Kamala Harris, who's not popular. For those who want to understand American politics even in more detail, including to Congress, I got about 2 more minutes and I'm done here, is that the majority of the population now lives in the suburbs, the areas around the city. It is going to be 40% of the House seats are in the suburbs. Everything that you want to look at is the mobilization in those counties, which all the counties I mentioned are mostly suburban areas at this point. We're looking at very few people in these counties. This is going to come into our congressional discussion here. Again, I won't go into this longer discussion about how everything is divided. The political parties are divided from one another. Each of the parties is divided. I can talk about more at a later point here, how we seem to be in an era in American politics of perpetual gridlock and political mood swings. We can talk all about the generational divide in American politics, that increasingly, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a split between older voters and younger voters. I'll pass over this other stuff here. But this is important because one of the problems that Biden is facing is the Israeli-Gaza factor, that he's in a dilemma. On the one hand, he needs the support of the Jewish vote in the United States to win the election. The Jewish voters have been a strong constituency. On the other hand, young people, who he also needs to be able to vote for him, are increasingly supportive of Gaza and the Palestinians and opposed to U.S. foreign policy. Biden needs to figure out a way of threading the needle. I don't know if he's going to be able to do that. So now, in the last few minutes here, if the presidential election were held today, looking at those 5 or 6 critical swing states, assuming for the sake of argument that it's only 5 states in play, right now, 45 states are done. We know this effectively. Right now, Biden starts off with 232 electoral votes. Trump starts off with 235 electoral votes. There are 5 swing states with undecided with 71 electoral votes. Based on today's polling, Biden wins maybe Michigan and Wisconsin for 25 electoral votes. Trump wins Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania with 46. As of today, Trump probably wins the presidency with 281 electoral votes. Actually, since I put this slide together, polls are suggesting that in Michigan and Wisconsin, it's dead even. Not a good sign for him. Think about some things that could happen between now and election day. The October surprises. Again, if Trump is convicted, perhaps. Increasingly, a month and a half ago, you couldn't talk about this in the United States. But now people are starting to say, what if, for either of the candidates, there's a medical emergency, that one or both of them have to leave the race because of all kinds of health reasons? What could happen? What will happen with the Israeli-Gaza war? Campus protests across the United States are not playing well for Biden, and I will argue that if the protests occur at the Chicago Democratic National Convention, the way I think they're going to happen, that's also not going to help. Ukraine, China, maybe issues in terms of what's going to happen down the line. What happens with the southern border, inflation? Could our U.S. Supreme Court issue other decisions that impact? And then third-party candidacy. And just to lighten it up a little bit here, the Taylor Swift endorsement factor. Is that if Taylor Swift were to enter and say, I endorse Joe Biden, given the fact that her supporters, young women under the age of 30, don't vote that high a percentage, that could actually impact the election. And then, of course, there could be other black swans or unknowns in terms of the election here. And hold on, we're stuck. One more slide. I think I have one more slide. Or not? Or is that it? I have one more. Okay. Hold on. I've lost. Where is it? Hold on.
No, don't worry.
Okay, no problem.
Just leave it there. You're on the speaker side.
Okay, did we lose it?
Just
Okay. All right. So my closing comment here will be to say I wanted to give you some background, hopefully a lot of detail on American politics. What does this mean in terms of European security issues at this point? Well, clearly, if we go back to where Trump was president, Trump was not a strong supporter of NATO, not a strong supporter of multilateral treaty or multilateral agreements. There's significant concern, at least from a European security perspective, that he may not be supportive continuously of U.S. aid to Ukraine, even though there is bipartisan support for that. And with that, I should also point out that regardless of whether it is Trump versus Biden in terms of the president, the focus is inevitably going to be shifting away even more from Europe, and is going to be shifting towards China, as you pointed out also, which raises the issue regarding if the United States is not there as a guarantee of European security, who will be there? And I think this is partly why Macron and others are starting to talk about Europe alone, about a Europe without the United States there. All right, thank you very much.